Chevy is finally bringing America the 1-2 EV punch that they've been promising for a while with the new Blazer EV and the upcoming Chevy Equinox EV. Today I'm down in San Diego driving the first of these. This is the Blazer EV, and Chevy says this is not just targeted at EV shoppers that live in California or New York. They're saying this is the mid-sized EV SUV designed for middle America. So let's take a look. As we see in the gasoline lineup, the Blazer EV and the Equinox EV are going to be separated by size and price. The Blazer is a little bit longer, a little bit wider, and it's a bit more expensive as well. At the moment, it starts around $52,000. There are less expensive models coming soon, and the Equinox EV, that's going to start around $35,000. But both models were definitely designed to fit in with the design language at Chevy. They look like the rest of the vehicle lineup, and honestly, this looks like it could be the next generation gasoline Blazer. We already have seen some spy shots and some preliminary photos of that next generation Blazer, and sure enough, it looks an awful lot like this. We have a big light bar that spans the entire front of the vehicle. This is a design cue that Chevy's had for a while, but instead of being chrome, it's now illuminated. We have full LED headlights here, and the headlight is actually part of the module that also contains the daytime running lights and the turn signals up front. This is an active aero intake right here. It helps smooth out the air across the front end. And the entire design is designed to make us look a little bit wider and a little bit more premium, I guess you'd say, than the Equinox. Although clearly related, the Blazer and the Equinox are not styled like Russian nesting dolls, and I think that was the right decision. The Blazer has this relatively large faux grille going on right here. It has some indentations to give it a bit more of a 3D appearance, although logically most of the cooling is happening down at the bottom of the bumper. This model wears the RS badge because this is one of the first trims to go on sale, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But you should know that the least expensive version of the Blazer and the most expensive version of the Blazer are not available at the launch. Dimensionally, the Equinox and the Blazer are pretty close together. This is 192.2 inches long, so about 6 inches longer than the Model Y, but only about 2 inches longer than the new Equinox EV. Like the Equinox, it has a pretty low roof profile, giving this a bit more of a muscle car electric wagon vibe to it. But we have a longer wheelbase than we find in the Equinox. This is 120 inches approximately, giving us notably more rear legroom and a slightly different cargo arrangement in the back. The other difference is a little bit less obvious, and that is the Blazer's wider than the Equinox. So the rear seats and the front seats are going to feel a bit roomier as far as hip room and shoulder room. This definitely feels like a larger and airier cabin. Direct competition to this would of course be something like the Ioniq 5 or the Mustang Mach-E, although those options would obviously also compete with the Chevy Equinox. And that's what's a little bit different with Chevy's strategy. They're giving us a mid-sized EV SUV and a compact EV SUV, where most car companies are giving us just one model in that segment. Over here we find the charge door. It is a powered charge door just on the driver's side. We'll take a look at that in a bit, but it does have a power open and close door. Similar styling, but obviously no charge door over there on the other side. To put the scale of the Blazer in perspective, these are 21-inch wheels on this RS trim. They're wrapped in 275/45 R21 tires, and the tire and wheel options are going to change based on the trim level you select. Out back, we find full LED taillight modules, but the turn signals are red, not amber. I actually think that amber turn signals would have helped break up the rear end design a bit more, especially in a white vehicle like the one that we're looking at now. The lower bumper is always going to be black in this trim. This is an RS all-wheel drive that we're taking a look at right now. We have a windshield wiper back here, something that a lot of EVs have been ditching, but Chevy has decided to keep on the Equinox and the Blazer EVs because they're targeting more of a mainstream customer than more of an EV advocate customer. Up here we have some aero fins, I guess you'd say. This is basically sort of like a spoiler on top of the hatch. It helps clean up the air as it flows around the back of the vehicle. And when you go in for a closer look, you'll notice there's definitely a lot of attention to aero on this, and that's part of why we find these taillight modules that wrap around into this bumper section, and those also help clean up the air as it goes past the vehicle. Quite logically, the Blazer and the Equinox are going to share some drivetrain components, but the Blazer is going to offer more power and more selection. There are going to be two different battery options, 85 kilowatt hours or 105 kilowatt hours, and your choice of front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, a rear-biased all-wheel drive system, or a front-biased all-wheel drive system. Yes, all four are going to be available in one vehicle, and that is pretty unique around the world. At the moment, only two models are going to go on sale initially though. the rear-wheel drive model, giving you 340 horsepower, 325 pound-feet of torque, or the first all-wheel drive system, which is actually the one with the bigger front motor, that's going to give you 288 horsepower total, 333 pound-feet of torque. And it's split in kind of an interesting way. 241 horsepower on the front, 68 horsepower in the rear, but the max power output total is 288. Right now I am driving the all-wheel drive RS trim, but I was able to also drive the rear-wheel drive model. Coming a little bit later, if you want more power, there's going to be the SS trim that's going to bump power up to 557 horsepower, 684 pound-feet of torque, and it's going to have a rear power bias. We aren't quite sure about all the battery and motor combinations just yet, but the all-wheel drive model that's going on sale initially is going to be offered with the small battery pack. The rear-wheel drive model is going to be offered with the big battery pack, and logically, the SS model gets the big battery as well. Chevy has been a little bit cagey on the range figures for the base front-wheel drive model and the upcoming range-topping SS trim, although we know that the SS is going to get the bigger battery pack. The front-wheel drive trim, we don't know, but it's probably going to get the smaller battery pack like we find in this all-wheel drive model. This is rated for 279 miles. If you get the single-motor rear-wheel drive model with the big battery, that bumps up to 324. Both are going to have the same AC charge speed, 11 kilowatts on board with that charge connector there in the front quarter panel, but DC charging is going to depend on the battery pack you choose. If you get the smaller battery pack, again, all-wheel drive at the moment, then things will top out at 150 kilowatts. If you get the bigger battery pack on the SS or the rear-wheel drive trims, then that bumps up to 190 kilowatts. Because in the Ultium platform, DC fast charge speeds definitely depend on the number of modules in the system. Unfortunately, we don't have charging curves for either battery pack, so we don't really know how long it's going to take to go from 0 to completely full, but Chevy says you can get usable range in about 10 minutes. I haven't had quite as much time with the Blazer EV today as I'd like, but I did find the front seats to be fairly comfortable. You should know that the driver and front passenger seats in this trim don't have the same range of motion, and the driver's seat does not offer four-way lumbar support, something I would really love to see. The big difference between these two seats is that the power passenger seat bottom cushion does not adjust for tilt. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion, and the seating position is a little bit more upright than some of the more elongated EVs that we find on the market. So this does feel a bit more SUV-like than, say, an Ioniq 5. Although this really long dashboard that I'll show you in a second does have a little bit more of a maybe sedan wagon-like vibe. Headroom is definitely generous in this model. I have about 4 inches of headroom left. Now this one does not have any sort of glass roof. It is just a regular steel roof. So if you wanted a really upright driving position, even at 6 feet tall, I could easily achieve a very, very upright position thanks to that roof line there, high enough actually that I can't really even see all the instrument cluster anymore. A big reason to get the Blazer over the Equinox is going to be the back seat. It's wider and it's roomier than the Blazer's back seat. Definitely one of the roomiest in this segment in the real world. The seat bottom cushion is a little bit close to the ground for my tastes, but it's probably going to be more comfortable for children. And speaking of children, check out how much room we have between this front seat and the back seat. That means this is definitely going to be able to accommodate some of those larger rear-facing child seats. Sitting here behind myself, I have, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 inches of legroom left, and definitely pretty generous headroom as well. I actually have maybe about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of headroom there. Sliding over to the middle seat, this is even further down towards the ground than the outboard seating positions, kind of a reverse bucket format, so plenty of headroom there. All the way over here, this front seat's all the way back in its tracks. You can see I still have several inches of legroom left. So if you have taller folks up front and you want to put child seats in the back, adults in the back, this is going to be a solid option. The other thing you'll notice is that the side of the roofline here doesn't hit my head on the side like it does, say, in an EV6. Sitting in a more natural position here, the side is maybe about 1.5 inches away. It's closer in than it is over here for the front passenger, but it's much further away than some of those more aerodynamic profiled vehicles, really helping improve the comfort for the rear passengers. We have a 60/40 folding back seat with an armrest with cup holders right there, and these rear seats offer 2-stage recline. From this angle, you can see just how wide this interior really is. Going down here to the center console, or at least the back of the center console, we find the same air vents that we find up front. That's an interesting twist because a lot of vehicles with nice air vents up front, whether they're knurled like this or the fancy electronic kind, you actually just get kind of plain air vents in the rear, and here we have the exact same ones as the front. Below that we have USB-C charge ports, heated outboard seats, and then you'll notice just a very tiny hump right here in the middle. It's not quite a completely flat floor in the rear. That is likely either a structural element or somewhere for the battery cables to go. As I said, the rear seats offer a recline function, but it's not an extraordinary one. This is the most upright position. That is the most reclined position. Hopping inside, clearly we need to talk about the elephant in the room first, and that is that this absolutely enormous 17-inch LCD does not feature Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Yes, it is running Android Automotive, the Android operating system for infotainment systems that we find in a number of different vehicles, but that's not the same thing as Android Auto. And Apple CarPlay? Absolutely not. GM says that they think this is a better experience for you. I definitely have my doubts, and I know a lot of people out there buying new cars really love CarPlay, so be sure and let me know what you think down there. Is that a deal breaker for you? I have to admit, for me, it's pretty darn close to a deal breaker. If you want to know more about this software, we'll take a deeper dive in a separate video, but you should know that up here we have the power button for the system. Over here we have the volume knob, really well integrated into the LCD. And I love the size and the scale of this LCD. I also really like the Google Mapping interface. It, of course, is going to give us charging information, state of charge upon arrival, etc. So if I click that little option there, it's going to route us to that location. It's going to tell us what our battery state of charge will be when we get there. Pretty typical fare for an EV. And as we've seen in other GM EVs, if I go back to the home screen, we get a reasonable amount of control and information over the EV system. So you can see energy efficiency, energy usage there. You also have a reasonable amount of control over charging. So if I go over here, for instance, I can actually have it precondition the battery. That would, of course, be if you want to manually go to the station, just drive there, you can precondition. If it's programmed in as a destination, then it's automatically going to precondition the battery for you. Now let's get to the rest of the interior. Again, really big LCD. I think that's a fantastic thing. It is so big that this just over 11-inch instrument cluster somehow feels small by comparison, even though this is actually really quite large in its own right. This display is highly configurable, and of course it offers turn-by-turn navigation directions that Google Mapping has just pulled right out of the infotainment system. Moving back from there, we have the latest Chevy steering wheel. There's a small paddle on this side. That's the regenerative braking paddle, so if I don't have it in one pedal drive mode, I can just pull on that paddle and get maximum regen. Over here we have the steering wheel heater button. You'll find infotainment controls on the back, volume up, down over here, track forward, backward on the left. Your radar adaptive cruise controls over here as well. This model will be available with Super Cruise, but we don't have it on this model. That's why we don't have that light up portion on top of the steering wheel. Moving to the center of the dashboard, some styling cues have definitely been borrowed out of other Chevy models, most notably these round air vents that are definitely very sort of a Chevy Camaro-like and definitely similar to the gasoline Blazer. There are a lot of nice touches in here, like these little colored little doodads in that sort of turbine-style air vent. You do rotate them around to close, kind of similar to what we find on the Chevy Trax. Over here on the passenger side, we find lots of stitching going on. Depending on the trim, you'll even find sort of red and blue stitching combos, but this is not an optional storage area. In fact, storage is somewhat limited in the Blazer. This is actually just a trim panel right there. It's not a shelf to store anything. We have a pretty standard sized glove box there. I was not able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. Moving sort of out of order for our usual look around the interior, let's go and take a look at the doors. Lots of soft touch materials on the upper section of the doors and some attractive knurled touches there. That kind of goes with the trim behind that transparent plastic piece. And it also matches the trim on this absolutely enormous dashboard. This is really, really long there. You can see that that large speaker grille spans from one side to the other. We also have a heads-up display there for the driver. The seats themselves, they have a relatively flat profile to them, so not terribly aggressive bolstering on the back or bottom cushion. That means that larger folks shouldn't have any problem finding a good seating position, although I did find myself sitting more on the seat rather than in the seat, if that makes sense to you. We have height adjustable headrests and height adjustable shoulder belts, and since this is the RS trim, you can see just barely we have RS embossed right there. These seats are both heated and ventilated, which helps reduce energy consumption. Moving back to the center console, you will notice we don't have a floating center console. It's just a solid center console, just like a regular Blazer. We do have a fairly deep storage bin right here. You can see there's a tiny bottle of water in there, 2 USB ports there. Those are charge only. We then get 2 cup holders here, a Qi wireless charging mat, and another storage cubby back here that's pretty big, but this has a lot less storage space than you'd find in, say, an Ioniq 5 or some of that competition. This USB port interfaces with the infotainment system, but it's worth noting that you cannot seem to use an iPhone as a USB media source. So if you want to play tunes and you want high quality audio, you really are going to have to use the integrated apps in this system, because there's no way to play that high quality audio off your iPhone since we don't have CarPlay. Bluetooth will reduce the audio quality. I haven't been able to spend an enormous amount of time in the Blazer EV out here in San Diego, but I have been able to drive both the rear-wheel drive and the all-wheel drive model. Rather unusually for an EV, the single motor Blazer, at least the single motor model that is available now, is actually going to be faster 0 to 60 than the dual motor model. And that's because the dual motor model available now has a smaller rear motor. It's about 68 horsepower in the rear, about 240 horsepower or so up front. And that means that if I play temporary hooligan, make sure it's clear here, and floor it from this stop sign, it's not really going to throw your head back in the seat like, say, the dual motor version of the Ioniq 5 would, because the power is actually further imbalanced and skewed towards the front. So a lot of power on the front. The rear motor is mainly used to improve traction, and in steady state travel, Chevy said it's not really used at all. It's more of a temporary use motor, basically, is one way to think of it. The rear-wheel drive model also has more power, and that's why it gets you 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds versus 6.7 seconds for this dual motor model. I actually think that both make an awful lot of sense in the lineup, because this model has greater regeneration potential than the rear-wheel drive model does because of the location of the front motor. This is something I was recently reminded of because at home it was about 40 degrees recently. I was driving in wet weather and I was driving a single motor rear-wheel drive Polestar that had pretty aggressive regen braking until I hit a really slick spot because it had summer tires on it and it was pretty cold. Then the system had to really dial things back and it felt a little bit squirrely there for a while. Not quite hairy, but definitely a little lively in the back. This setup does not have that particular feeling because the front tires are the ones doing the majority of the braking anyway, so you have greater regen potential on the front axle, and that's the logical reason we find this setup in this model. Of course, if you'd rather have a rear-wheel drive model, or a model with a bigger motor in the back, then they would love to sell you the other versions of the Blazer EV. All models are going to be relatively heavy on the downside though. It took this model 125 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour to 0 in my preliminary testing down here in San Diego, so it is going to take a little bit longer for this to stop than some competitive EVs, and that's just down to the curb weight. Chevy does make up for that by having relatively wide tires, notably wider than average. If you take a look at a Mach-E, for instance, it has 225 width tires on all versions except for the GT. Those only go up to 245s. This model has 275 width tires on it, so there is a reasonable amount of grip potential if you were to put grippier tires, and these tires on this model are a little bit more efficiency focused. But I think it does bode well for the upcoming SS trim. Now, as far as the general feel of the Blazer, this is not overtly sporty, I guess you'd say, at least not in this RS trim. It actually is a little bit more comfortable than you might expect. It doesn't have the firm and bouncy ride quality that we find in a Mach-E or in a Model Y. Even the Model Y with the comfort suspension, this is a bit more dialed in. But the steering does feel a little bit more ponderous, I guess you'd say, and there is definitely more body roll and more tip and dive than in those competitive EVs. It just seems like this was tuned to feel maybe a bit more grown up is probably the best way to describe it. I would assume, although we haven't been able to drive it, that the Equinox is going to feel a little bit tighter, a little bit smaller out on the road. The wide tires certainly help the Blazer EV out, but there's no disguising the curb weight, also just the general suspension tune. When it comes to handling, I'm going to give this model a B, but when it comes to the ride quality, I'm definitely going to give this model an A. It remains to be seen exactly how the base trim slots in here or how the SS trim slots in, but I would bet that the base model is probably going to have relatively narrow tires to help improve efficiency and really help give you the longest range possible with that battery pack. For final cabin noise and efficiency scores, you're going to have to wait until we get one of these at home, but preliminarily out here in San Diego, I measured 70 decibels at 50 miles an hour, putting this right in line with the bulk of the competition as far as cabin noise, and efficiency is pretty similar as well, 3.4 to 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour. And that was interestingly in both this dual motor model and in the single motor rear wheel drive model. That's probably because of how this dual motor model actually uses the second electric motor. In steady state driving, that rear electric motor isn't doing anything for us. It's actually just using the front motor. That's quite logical because the front motor can be more efficient, it can be a bit more powerful, they can save money on that rear motor, but it still gives us extra traction. So if I go over here to this sandy area right here and just floor it, it actually feels very similar to a lot of dual motor models where you get a little bit of front wheel spin up, then power goes to the rear, and the traction-based system moves power across the rear axle. So it is going to use the brakes to move power left and right across the back. This is the kind of vehicle where I was actually able to play in some of these sandier areas here. So for instance, I don't have any problem feeling bad about just coming over here to the sand and driving along in the sand. But this is not going to be quite as capable as something that had a more powerful rear electric motor. And if I floor it, you are definitely going to get front wheel spin. If we go back to the pavement here and transition with the throttle on full, You're also going to get a little bit of torque steer across the front that obviously you won't have in the rear-wheel drive model. We might get in the SS trim, but it's a little bit unsure at this time. Remember that pretty much any EV with a powerful motor on the front axle is going to give you a little bit of torque steer, so this is honestly not too unusual. You will find a hair of torque steer in something like a Rivian R1S and R1T just because of the massive amounts of power we find there, and even vehicles like a Kia EV6 GT, which is not direct competitor to this at all, it's much more powerful. It definitely has significant front-end pull, as do the performance versions of Model 3, Model S, Model X, etc., just because of the amount of power and torque we have on that front wheel. At least for the moment, the Blazer SS is not setting any performance benchmarks. That may be what the upcoming SS trim will do, 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds, etc., but the RS and the LT trim, these are really focused on Middle America. And I don't mean geographic Middle America, although if you're in Oklahoma, you might really want a Blazer EV. I'm talking more average American than geographically here, because most folks that are buying new cars, they don't want or need to go 0 to 60 in 3.8 or 3.9 seconds. Maybe 7 seconds is just fine. They don't really want a rock hard ride. They don't want summer tires because they're more expensive to keep around, etc. And that, I would say, is exactly where the Blazer comes in. This feels like a quicker, snappier, electrified version of the Chevy Blazer, but a lot of what has made the Blazer popular with Chevy customers really does apply to this electric model. It's roomy, it's comfortable, it's quiet, easy to live with, and then we have the added benefit of the electrification, the extra dynamicism that brings you as far as the acceleration, etc. But keep in mind, it is a little on the heavy side. At the moment, we don't have pricing or availability data for the entire Blazer lineup, but here's what we do know. The RS all-wheel drive and RS rear-wheel drive are already on sale. The 2LT all-wheel drive is coming shortly, followed by the police car production, then the SS trim, and finally, at some point later, the front-wheel drive model. That means that for now, at least, the Blazer does not start around $52,000. It starts at $56,715. That's for the 2LT all-wheel drive using the same battery pack and motor setup that we find in this model. If you want the RS trim, exactly as you're seeing right here, this is $60,215, including the destination charge. And if you want to go rear-wheel drive, it's actually going to be a bit more expensive, $61,790. That makes sense because the rear-wheel drive model is going to be the fastest version at the moment, and it's going to give you the longest range with the biggest battery pack. And honestly, the battery is more expensive than the small electric motor we find in the back of this. The tax credit situation is a little bit complicated. If you buy a Blazer before December 31st, 2023, you will get the full $7,500 tax credit, assuming you qualify for the full credit, of course. After December 31, honestly, we don't know. The rules become more stringent for calendar year 2024, and we don't know all of the battery material sourcing on the Blazer EV. General Motors has said they feel well positioned, and of course this battery pack is manufactured in the United States, so that should qualify for at least half of the credit. We just don't know if it's going to get the complete credit. On the other hand, we know that General Motors leasing is not going to be passing along any sort of tax credit on leases for the Blazer EV, as we do see in some of the competition. And that could mean that if you really wanted to lease an EV because, say, you made too much money or you didn't have the tax liability for the credit, etc., you might want to look elsewhere, because this lease price is going to be based just on the purchase price of the vehicle, no preferential tax treatment going on there at all. I'm not entirely sure that a $60,000 Blazer is truly the EV for Middle America, but if you're looking for something that's roomy, quiet, comfortable, and efficient, you should definitely put the Blazer on your shopping list. Also, if you want something that's a bit wider in the back and a bit wider in the back seat area, you want to take a look at the Blazer over the Equinox or the Ioniq 5 or the Ford Mustang Mach-E, because that is one significant advantage of this vehicle. The other advantage is likely going to be the tax credit situation, because again, this may qualify for the full credit in 2024, and keep in mind that 2024 is going to start allowing point of sale tax credits. That could effectively lower the price tag of this to something a lot more similar to some of those smaller options like the Ioniq 5 or the Kia EV6 that are not built in North America and therefore do not qualify for the tax credit on purchases. Now, if you lease the vehicle, things are definitely going to be different. It's going to depend on the residual value and whether or not that tax credit is factored in or not. And again, this is not going to be factored in at the moment. Bearing in mind that we have not tested this on our own home turf yet, I have to say at the moment that the Blazer is a solid option, but I don't know whether it's my top pick in the segment. There are certainly going to be more dynamic options out there. At $60,000, there are also going to be faster options out there. And those are two big issues, for me at least, with the Blazer EV. Personally, I'm a little bit more interested in the upcoming Equinox EV, so let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section, and let me know how you think the Blazer stacks up against the EV competition, or perhaps against the gasoline Blazer, because the gas Blazer is definitely going to be less expensive.